Hi, I'm Dave Whitefield and I help organisations tackle safety and risk through a focus on culture and engagement. In this video, I'm going to talk about the idea of safety and risk maturity, what it means to me, what it means to some clients I'm working with, and really, we debate a lot of stuff in health and safety, but I'm hoping to add to that conversation and give us some other points to talk about and communicate on within health and safety. We use lots of different language. It can mean different things to different people. And so this is my opportunity to share what it means. It's also a bit of a chance to talk about how, what being more mature in your approach to risk could look like and how it compares to some of the more traditional approaches in safety and some of the trade-offs and unintended consequences that come with some of those different approaches there. All of the work I do is based from within a social psychological framework. So social psychology is about how people are influenced by the world around them. I think that framework or paradigm is very well suited to looking at culture and the people side of safety. It's not good at talking about other aspects of safety in the same way that some of the other paradigms or philosophies are not good at tackling culture. The other thing that I just want to talk about, this work, I usually find myself in the room where an organisation has decided they want to do more work around safety, but have recognised that they don't want to do more of what they've been doing. The stereotypical sort of example here would be recognising that more paperwork or policies or rules is not going to continue to get improvement. So there's a recognition of focusing on the people side of it, but it turns out that's pretty tricky. And so often, I'm there where organisations are saying we want to do something different or new. I know organisations are often after a solution, but that's one of the things I come in and say that's not, we're not going to get a solution here. Safety and risk are wicked problems that we can only tackle. But what I'm getting at underneath that is we're not trying to change or fix or correct. We don't have a group of problem people we're trying to change. This is about how do we realistically do more work in safety that makes a difference, but isn't more of the same. And it typically, for me anyway, that's where they want to work on the people bit of it. And so I've often described this as being more mature in your approach to safety and risk, and that's what we're going to talk about today, some of those, what's it look like and some of the trade-offs. So let's start with the trusty whiteboard. I'm using the whiteboard. I know it's pretty clunky and it's not ideal. I could probably do a presentation, but this is more natural for me in the way I'd typically be presenting anyway. So this is one of the trade-offs. We're going to go with the whiteboard. So thinking about risk, right? Most organisations I start working with would see risk and their approach to risk as managed. They manage risk, right? That's the philosophical approach. That's not a surprise. It's in all the standards and legislation is risk management or we manage risk. So that's cool. But what I'm going to put forward is the approach of managing risk anchors us to certain approaches. So where organisations are like, well, a bit of paper's never going to keep somebody safe. It's what people do. That, we get that. But ironically, it's our anchor to managing risk, which might stop us stepping into that space, right? And hopefully I'll make sense of that as I keep going. So what I'm talking about in my language, and language is nearly always how we see culture exist and how we influence it, but it's a double-edged sword there. What I'm talking about is moving towards a space where you can embrace risk. So embracing risk is about genuinely bringing it in and saying we are a risk-taking organisation. We accept the natural variation and the variability and the uncertainty and the unpredictability. We have trust and faith, but we're never really sure. And that sounds maybe obvious, but is difficult for organisations to do. I totally understand that. And what is much more easy to do is to go, well, we're going to manage it. The problem is managing risk as a philosophy implies that you can manage all risk. It's built in. That's our job, right? Whereas embracing risk sits genuinely within the uncertainty. Now, again, what I want to say is in the early days of safety, when you genuinely have got a lot of stuff to do, managing risk makes much more sense because I do think it's easier to relate to hazards and systems that way. But what I'm saying is once you get to a certain point, there's a need to shift the language to be more mature, like getting a new job or getting older. That's why it's an and, not a instead of, right? So I'm going to talk about what this looks like, but I want to go to the other end, of course, and say, well, if you don't embrace risk, what do you do? And do we see that now? And what I'm saying, this isn't a old approach. This isn't a, what did we see 50 years ago? We still see this now. And this is why I think we get unexpected or undesired results. At the opposite end of embrace, we might see reject, as in rejecting the idea of risk, the philosophy or the concept of unpredictability and uncertainty and uncontrollability, right? We reject it. Now that might sound weird, but how do you view incidents or unexpected results, right? Well, if you're a zero organisation and you genuinely think that every single event is preventable, my argument is you're rejecting the very concept of risk. And that does some unusual things. And it's why I'm not a fan of it. I think it has more negatives than positives, more negative trade-offs than positives. And that's why I would not advocate for it. And in fact, that's why I advocate for the opposite of not just managing, but embracing risk. So in a rejection state, any incidents or unwanted or unplanned events are bad. They're negative. We tend to deny that they exist even, or that they're possible. And it's why they get hidden. In a managed state, we tend to look at things like fix or correct. So we get an unwanted event or an incident, we're really fixated on fixing it or correcting it, right? And I get that makes sense, but after a certain point, there might not be more you can do. The very premise of risk involves a level of acceptability. It involves not perfection. This is perfection. This is the opposite of perfection, right? Which doesn't mean accepting everything's going to go wrong, but it's accepting we're not perfect, okay? So what I'm talking about here is organisations that embrace risk, and this is part of the language that we try and inject and share within the organisation, is what they do is they see errors and unwanted or unexpected events as a learning opportunity. So they anchor to learning, right? So every event that happens, they're like, oh, that's interesting. And the obsession then, if you want to have an obsession, is what happened, what can we learn from it, as opposed to what are you doing about it. So if you can hear that subtle shift, and this is what we would coach leaders in, is going, instead of saying, what are you doing about that? It's what do you know about that, or what have you learned? And if somebody says, we don't know what happened yet, it's like, cool, well, let me know when you do. Whereas when we get anchored to managing, there's an assumption that you can fix it. So I ask organisations and leaders, is it possible you could have an event and not know what happened? And usually there's like well, it's possible. And then I say, is it possible you could do an investigation and not have corrective actions? And usually the answer is, oh no, which means there's an anchor to fixing. You have to find something to fix or correct. And nearly always what it ends up with is people, right? So it's, again, what I'm saying is the anchor to the language and the philosophy starts to cause some undesired events, right? Once you've got to a certain level. So that's an example of how we treat incidents or unwanted data or unexpected events. Now, unexpected things happening. So I want to talk about a few more things here. I've just got some notes I want to make sure that I'm focusing on here as well. So if we think about people, in the sort of at this rejection end down here, we tend to think about controlling people. If we can, we might want to eliminate people. So I've heard organisations that are really fixated on zero, and when they get really dejected at the fact that things keep happening, they're like, wouldn't it be easier if we could just get rid of people? Right? It's because of the philosophy or the approach. Like, in an imperfect world, the only way to achieve zero is to try and get rid of the things that are imperfect, right? And it turns out that's people. At a managing, then this does tend to be more of a, like this is sort of we might prevent human error. So the human error stuff's been around for a while. So again, in a pure sense, I'd always say it's not great. It'll nearly always still end up blaming a person. But I understand that a lot of organisations will I say this carefully, but they'll think they are taking a holistic view and be like human factors, which is how does the system suit the person and that sort of stuff, or systems thinking. And I'm not saying it's wrong, it just doesn't always have the desired outcome. In saying that, human factors is still treating the human as a factor in the system. It's not human-centered. So this work that I'm doing is about embracing risk in a human-centered approach. It's not always right. I'm just saying that's the philosophy that I bring to a more mature approach to risk. So at that embracing end, what that looks like is, and I'm going to use the word embrace because it fits here really well, but you embrace fallibility. So, if I can spell right. So what this is about is actually saying we totally get that humans are fallible. So instead of our language and our questioning being how do we prevent human error, the languaging is how do we help people manage fallibility? Because we know people are fallible, right? We know humans are fallible. What do we do to best support people and the organisation to manage that fallibility? There are things we already try and do with this. It's just that when something goes wrong, we come back up to fix. And then it's like, well, how did you make a mistake? How did you make an error? So you would completely eliminate the language of human error. You would never use it in the organisation, if possible. That's where you're embracing risk. Let's talk about information. So down at a rejection end, these organisations do a lot of telling. I'm going to tell you because we reject uncertainty. So once I've told you, you know. Once you've done the induction, you know. Once you've signed off on the swims, you know. So it's all telling. In the middle here, this is probably, it's been around forever, is the idea of consulting. And you can do some genuine consulting there, like and share and get feedback from people. Moving towards the embracing end, this is shifting towards the idea of engage. So genuinely, and by engage here, I'm not saying, because I hear this a lot, is the workforce aren't engaging on safety, or how do we get the workforce more engaged? What I'm talking about here is this is about the organisation and leaders engaging with the workforce. They're typically fine on their own, right? It's if you want them to do something or be involved, it's how do you engage with them? And one of the principles that sits here is things like skin in the game, which comes from the work of fragility. So how do we get skin in the game? Every single person who's affected by a decision gets a say in the decision. It's a drastic shift. It's much harder. That's why it's not done, but it's nearly always better. And it's about embracing it, because to embrace risk and uncertainty, you embrace the fact that we have to hear from people and involve people in it, and it's messier and less controllable in that sort of way from there. If we think about hazards, so down on the reject end, this would typically be our goal is to eliminate. And I get that. In some areas, if you can eliminate, sure. But most of the time in the world of managing risk, we're not trying to here. So we're trying to control. And that's where we are most often. We're controlling risk on that way. Controlling hazards. Now, this sounds weird. And to be honest, I'm still working on some of this myself. And it's one of these areas where I'm like, I don't know how this sounds. But in an ideal world, when I'm coaching organisations in this way, I actually suggest that we stop using the word hazard. So I think once you've got a good handle on what can cause harm, there's less benefit in continuing to use the language. And what I say is shift towards risk. And in fact, by the way, even safety in general here, I talk to clients about, you only talk about safety as kind of this passive outcome. Everything's about risk and the work we do. So risk is the work or the input, safety is the outcome. So with hazard, I just think there's less value in, and by the way, this practically, you never ask what's the hazard. What you do is you shift the language to what could happen, what could go wrong, how could we get hurt, how much do we know about it? It's shifting the language away from hazard. Again, I think hazard has a place early on, but once you've got a good handle on what can cause harm, I think it starts anchoring us to a bit of old school safety. Also, safety risk is the only brand or slice or flavour of safety that uses the word hazard. So hazard is not used in environmental risk management, quality, people, legal, reputational, financial. It's just not used. So in those other types of risk, they only talk about risk. So again, it's a more consistent approach would be my argument there, all right? If we think about systems down at the reject end, systems tend to be about rules and punishment. That's the way they're seen. Very much a kind of you broke the rule, that's it, 0, right, you're gone. In the middle here, again, I'm going to use this language of the systems are about control or direction. The system set the direction. That's why you do it, because it's in the system. Whereas over on this embracing bit, because we're human focused over here, this is about the idea of support or tools. So instead of saying, what does the procedure say, it's how does this help people think or communicate about risk? Think and or communicate. So the idea of tools and systems is they're thinking and or communication tools. How do they do it? So it's a different questioning, and they're seen as that in that way, right? The system supports rather than directs. And again, that's a shift. And we see that in the work of, work as planned versus work as done is shifting the power right onto that. So let's talk about power as the last one here. So where does the power sit? Well, this is again one of those ones where I'm like, I'm not 100% on this, but it's the way I'm currently interpreting it. That in this sort of zero or rejecting of risk, because you're rejecting of the idea of people even thinking about risk and making their own decisions, I see the power as really sitting up with leaders. And what I mean is it's a very autocratic approach. If something goes wrong, the leaders make a decision and go, yeah, that was wrong. That's how people get fired, right? You get fired because you broke a safety rule, and there's no like, oh, but, or I did this, or this is why, or hang on, it's your pressure on time that made me make the trade-off that way. It's just this very direct down, I'm firing you for your own benefit because you're unsafe. In the management approach, I think the power tends to sit with the system. And so what I'm getting at there is that it's all about what the system says. Did you have the paperwork? Did you sign off? So subtle things that, like, after an event, it's not did you understand the risks? It's did you have a risk assessment? Or even when people say, did you do a risk assessment? What they mean is, do you have one? It's that subtle, the languaging all directs towards the power and the system and the paperwork side of it. Obviously, what I'm talking about here by embracing risk is embracing the uncertainty, the unpredictability that comes with the people side of it. And so, sorry about the bang there. So this is about, embracing that people and moving towards the power at the people end. Now, there are a lot of underlying models, high reliability organising, cultural maturity. There's lots of other stuff that fits into all of these areas. And again, I'm not suggesting that what I'm saying here is radically a solution, right? Because I think nearly everything here, I hear organisations and I hear people say, the fallibility stuff probably is a bit less common, but this idea of a bit of paper's never going to save you. But what I was suggesting earlier is it's our anchoring, because we're sort of still anchored to managing, that holds us to this approach. And so as much as we might try and get a little bit more mature, once something goes wrong, we end up coming back because we're anchored to fixing. This requires a genuine shift in leaders and a willingness to accept some less control, less measurement, less predictability. It happens on the foundation of a really good basis of managing safety and managing risk, right? And it's a shift in the language. So you shift away from safety and hazard towards risk and people and fallibility and engagement and learning, and it's all in the language. There can be other work in the background around decluttering and making tools more suitable, but that's sort of fundamentally what it looks like, and it does feel uncomfortable, right? It's a natural change, and that's the way these things work. And if there's one sort of question that I kind of come back to all the time, just to talk about what this looks like around embracing risk at a people-centered approach. If you think about it this way and go, well, how many risk decisions are made every day in the organisation? How many decisions are made by individuals with some uncertainty? And, the number's pretty big, right? How many risk decisions are made? So we're not talking about the fact that they're bad, because usually the reason we're here is they're pretty good. But the shift comes to, well, how do we best support people to make the best risk decision, given how many are being made? And that's why it's a focus towards people-centered, but embracing risk, because we cannot define everything, we can't know everything, you can't measure everything as much as we would want to. So thanks for listening. Just some food for thought there around embracing risk through a people-centered approach. And let me know what you think. Comments if this is online. Give me a call, send me an email. Let me know what you think. Thanks for listening. Bye.